Welcome to the Love Intervention. I'm Pastor Evans.
I'm Mrs. Evans.
Now, the Love Intervention is a Christian perspective on dating, courtship, and marriage. Now, even though neither my wife nor myself are licensed couples therapists, we have had many conversations and we've been married for almost 20 years.
20 years this December.
Right. So we're bringing what we know from all that time to you today. Now, speaking of today, our topic today is sex.
Let's talk about...
Oh, we ain't paying for that song.
All right.
So today we're going to talk about sex. Today we're going to talk about sexual relationships. And just like this conversation, it doesn't always get together.
Let's talk about sex.
So we're talking about sex today from a Christian perspective.
Right.
Now remember to like, subscribe, and share so that other folks can get this good content. All right? Sexual relationships today. Let's go.
Sexual relationships today? So today's topic is sex. While I was doing
sex.
Right. While I was doing some investigation and I was online trying to get more information about the topic as it relates to a Christian perspective, I came across an article written by Probe, I believe magazine, online. And the quote is, which I very much agree with, is sex is God's idea. He made it not only efficient for making babies, but pleasurable and deeply satisfying. So sex is God's idea. What do you think about that?
That sex is God's idea? I think that sex is has to be God's idea.
Right.
Because there's no way that something can be that good if God didn't make it.
Right.
That's what I think.
Right.
All good things come from God.
Right.
Yes.
And so today our question is, what do we believe about sex? What do you believe about sex? What do we believe about sex?
Right. And I know this is a pretty broad topic because people think a whole lot of things about sex, and our show is a Christian perspective on these things. And a lot of times we don't hear talk about sex in the church in the first place,
right,
or in Christian churches in the first place. So now we're having this conversation about sex as a Christian thing,
right,
or as a God-made thing. So I think that it's an interesting topic. Hopefully it's interesting. That's why we chose to talk about it, right? So much of what we believe about sex in our culture comes from our culture, not what our faith teaches. For us, Christianity teaches us one thing about sex and when it should be done, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And other faith beliefs teach other things about sex, and most faith beliefs teach that you're not supposed to have sex unless you're in a marital type relationship.
Right.
But what we believe most times, Christians and other folks and non-Christians alike, is deeply entrenched in the culture that we live in.
Right.
Right. So American culture would teach one thing, and other cultures may teach something else. But it's deeply influenced by where you live and the time you live in too.
Right. Yeah. And so in the article that I told you about earlier, from Probe, the title of the article is "What God Says About Sex: A Christian Perspective on Human Sexuality." It talked about present day culture. And in that article, they spoke about a process called the pickling process. And let me just read what they said about it, because I thought it was interesting.
Right.
Most of us are like pickles. We sit in the brine of a sex-saturated culture, absorbing its values and beliefs, and it changes the way we think. Even most Christians are pickled today, believing and acting exactly like everyone else who has been sitting in the brine of a culture hostile to God and His Word.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think that we don't pay attention to the fact of the culture that's around us, like the things that we watch, the music that we listen to. All those things make up your culture,
Right.
and all the things that we are exposed to on a daily basis run counter to what God would have us do. Now we know as Christians that God says that sex is reserved for marriage, and we'll talk about that later. But even Christian parents tend to say things like, don't have sex until you're in a committed relationship. Right? And a committed relationship is not the same thing as being married, right? Well, we'll talk about that in a later episode too. But just like pickles, I think the first of all,
Just like cucumbers?
Yes, thank you, cucumbers. First of all, I think the title is funny. Just get that out.
Right.
Because I've been a boy and a man my whole life. So the pickling process is just funny to me.
Right.
So let's just get that out of there.
Right.
So, but just like cucumbers start out one way. A cucumber is firm, cucumber is firm and strong before it goes through the pickling process.
Right. And it's also natural.
It's natural, and all its nutrients are in there, and and you don't have that salt and sodium that'll swell you up.
Right.
Right. But after sitting in the brine for a while, I don't actually know how long it takes to make cucumbers pickles.
Right.
Probably should have researched that before we did this video. But the fact that the cucumber doesn't know what's happening.
Right.
It's just in the brine,
Right.
in the sauce, absorbing that, and it changes its very nature.
It changes not only its very nature, but it changes its appearance too.
Right.
Right.
Changes the appearance.
It changes the inside.
Changes the inside from the inside out.
Right.
Right. Because pickles look nothing like, well, they don't look very much like cucumbers once they become pickles. No.
More like soggy cucumbers, maybe.
Right. Right. So now we're
Just
sitting
walking
in the
around
brine.
being soggy?
Right.
We just soggy?
Just soggy. I think it's appropriate to be soggy. You talk about being soggy after sex. So back to the topic. So this pickling process, like I really appreciate the article. I really appreciate the author. I appreciate the fact that you found it because it gives a great picture of what happens when we allow ourselves to absorb the culture.
That's almost impossible to not absorb something, but we must be aware of what's happening,
Right.
So that we can maybe stop the process that we're in,
Right.
and try to do other things to give us a better state of mind,
Right.
or
Yeah. Yeah. So the thing becomes that, just to continue with our thoughts on sex and sexual relationships, right? A lot of times in the culture, people try to separate sex from emotion. They'll say
Right.
stuff like, "Oh, it was just sex," or "It's just about sex," and there's supposedly no emotion involved in it.
right,
But as far as I know, it's difficult to have sex without actually being emotionally involved because you're exposed.
right,
Generally, you're naked.
physically and emotionally.
Physically and emotionally, you're exposed. Physically and emotionally, you're naked.
Right.
Right. It's the most vulnerable position that you could be in.
Right.
Right. So how could there not be emotion involved with that much vulnerability? People want to say there's not because it's easier. It's easier
Right.
to believe that there's no connection. There's nothing other than the sex involved. But that's not the case. That's what the culture, the brine, the pickling, would try to get you to believe.
Right.
Right. Has to be emotional. Right.
Right.
You know how I know it's emotional? You know how I know it's emotional? Because once you start having sex, it changes your whole relationship.
Yes, it does.
You cannot think the same way about that person after you have sex.
Right. You start to see them differently.
Right.
Or your mind starts to wander into the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then every time you see that person, you're like, oh, okay, clear
Right.
my mind, clear my mind,
Right.
clear my mind.
I remember talking to some young people a while back, and just kind of trying to talk to them about and explain the fact that once you, or was it us? Once you start having sex, or once you start having sex with someone, it's difficult for you to detach yourself from them. Particularly for, I think, and you can speak to this if you want.
Okay.
Particularly, I think for young ladies, because you give yourself to someone in that way.
Right.
And now, when the relationship begins to change, because it inevitably changes when young men get what they were trying to get.
Right.
When it begins to change, you begin to defend their
Right. You get very
bad
defensive.
Right.
Mainly because you don't want to have made a bad mistake.
Right.
Because you want to believe in this infatuation love that you thought you had or have.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And then the episode we did on Dadgummit. What was that episode? The last one we just did. What was the last episode?
Romance?
Romance.
Okay.
Right. So in the episode we did on romance, remember we talked about those 4 areas of love?
Right.
Sex was the last one.
Yeah, it was the last
It was the last one, and it should be the last one because it's the most physically intimate and emotionally vulnerable you should be with anyone.
Right, and it has to be supported by the first 3.
Right. Gotta go back and watch that episode. It was a good one. Talking about romance. Right. So it complicates things. It clutters your thoughts. You can't think clearly because, and I like how you put it, and that's why I wanted you to get to it. Is that it makes you think like, oh, this has to work.
Right.
I think people stay in relationships a whole lot longer than they should because they've had sex and they feel like, oh, this needs to work because I gave myself to them.
Because of the investment?
Because of the investment.
Right.
Yeah. Physical and emotional investment, even though a lot of times we don't want to admit it's an emotional investment.
Right.
Right. So what are some common mistakes you think people make regarding sex?
Well, one of them is personal gratification. And being in a pickling process culture, sometimes it leads you to believe that you can go to sex to gratify your needs or to satisfy your needs or to get gratification of your needs.
Right.
Without even having any connection at all to the person, right?
Right.
Now I know that there are apps out there. I'm not for sure because I've been married almost 20 years, but on the movies,
you better not know no app.
You know, they do all the swiping and stuff, and then they get hookups.
Right.
And in the movies, you just see the actor, the female actor, the male actor saying, "Oh yeah, it's good. Everything is good. Can we have sex now?"
Right.
And then they have sex, and then they just go on their ways, and they're like, "Oh, I didn't even know his name," or "Oh, I didn't even know her name."
Right.
And so that can be one of the common mistakes, is that it's for personal gratification.
Right.
Right. I mean, there is some personal gratification
real
to
talk.
Yeah.
Real talk. There's some personal gratification.
But not only.
Right. But not only.
And
you can really only have that real gratification in a marital relationship.
Right. Because everything else is selfish.
Right. Everything else is exactly. I don't care. I don't really care what you believe about Christianity. I do care what you believe about Christianity, but I don't care what you believe about whether or not you should wait until you get married to have sex.
Right.
But the level of comfort and the level of commitment and the level of gratification goes up.
Right.
Because of your commitment to that person.
Right.
Yeah. So personal gratification only is a mistake that people make.
Right. And
pretty common mistake.
I wanted to share another quote from the same article by Probe.
Right.
And it says, if the purpose and goal of sex is primarily pleasure, then other people are just objects to be used for sensual gratification. But let's consider who God is, okay? Since people are infinitely valuable because God made us in his image, that is a slap in the face, whether we realize it or not, that sex is just for personal or sensual gratification.
Right.
That's its primary purpose.
Right. And it can't be. And it's not just for, and I think in other cultures maybe, or other thoughts or other thought beliefs, it's just only for procreation too. Because that's not true.
Yeah,
If it was only for procreation, God wouldn't have made it feel like that. What? I'm serious.
Right.
So it's not just for that.
Right.
But I think what's interesting about the quote is that it says if that was the only reason, or when we look at it as is just for personal gratification, then the other person just becomes something that you
just an object.
Something that you want to that you needed for that pleasure.
Right.
Right. And then that doesn't value people at all. Right.
Not at all.
And I think that's where we get hurt, and that's where people get hurt when we're talking about sex, is when you feel, once you feel like you got used just for sex.
Right.
Now the way that you see yourself changes.
Right.
And nobody wants to feel like they're just a sex object.
Right.
People want to be sexy. But they don't want to just be sex.
Right. They don't want to just be sex.
Yeah. That's nasty. You just sex. See, this is why we call this the love intervention, because sometimes, look, somebody's watching right now and you just realize that you're just sex. You don't have to be.
Right.
You don't have to stay there.
Right.
You can change your state and your situation.
Or you realize that you are just sex, and so you go around having it a lot.
Right.
Because you feel like that's all you are. That's not who God called you to be, though.
Yeah, God didn't call you to be just sex.
Right.
He made you for way more.
You have so
than
much
that.
more to offer and to give. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, another common to that end, another common mistake is that virginity is abnormal.
Right.
You know, I don't even know if I don't think it's possible for virginity to be abnormal, seeing as how everybody at some point was a virgin.
Right. Everybody starts off.
That's the norm.
Right.
And being a virgin is normal.
Right.
Because everybody starts that way, right? And most of us get to choose when that ends, right?
Right.
So we were watching a show that we're not gonna say the name of the show because we're not paying them, but it was a marriage show.
Right.
And these particular people got married the first time that they saw each other. I think that's enough hints, right? So, and they had several couples, and we kind of watched them go through the journey of figuring out how to be married. And one of the couples struggled mightily because the wife in the couple was a virgin.
Right.
And that was the only real issue.
Right. The couple, they seem to get together well.
Right.
They seem to relate to one another. They enjoyed spending time together. They were supportive of each other.
Mm-hmm. But because of the pickling process, the wife felt like she had some insecurities because she felt like the husband was feeling a particular way.
Right.
And she was concerned about how to handle her virginity. And then the husband was like, it's too much pressure. I don't want to be the one that takes your virginity.
Right. But in the process, I think from watching the show, in the process, the husband felt like, okay, so you're a virgin. I found this out on our wedding night or whatever.
Right.
But we're going to have sex before the end of this period of time is up.
Mm.
And so he was okay with that because he felt like, but the closer they got to the end of the show and they hadn't had sex or they hadn't had any real sexual connection or intimate connection leading towards sex, the more it began to bother him because he was faking from the beginning, though.
Right.
He was faking that he was okay with it from the beginning.
Right. Or he was trying to be.
She was struggling with whether or not to have sex with him during the process.
Right.
Because she didn't want at the end for him to say, oh no, I want a divorce. And now she has given her virginity to a man who she thought was going to be her husband, but wasn't.
Right. Now, we said all that to say this. The virginity should have been a good thing in the marriage.
Right.
Quite frankly, both of them should have gone in to the marriage as virgins. Right. That way, your only experience is the person that you're with, because that's how it should be.
Right.
Or that's
Unfortunately, that's not
right
reality for this particular
for most
couple.
people, for that particular couple, and for most people in the culture now, that's not the reality.
Right, because they don't want to be virgins.
Right.
Right.
Because there's a stigma involved with not having sex.
Right.
And I think that that's interesting that we live in this society and culture that the not having sex is the stigma when it should be really that having a whole bunch of sex should be the stigma. Because why would you give yourself to that many people? You disagree?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. All right.
No.
So last one that we're going to talk about, and then you can put some others in the comments if you want. Last one that we're going to talk about is the last common mistake that people make is that sexual compatibility is merely physical, right? So what you hear from folks is, oh, you're about to get married, you better find out if you guys are compatible, because you don't want to be stuck with somebody for the rest of your life and the sex is bad.
Right. But the design was for both husband and wife to come together unexperienced and to learn together.
Right.
Right. And I've seen on a couple of other podcasts as well as some shows where they were making, they made the statement that no matter how many partners you've had, no matter how much sex you've had, you still have to learn what your husband or your wife enjoys during that time together, because it's going to be unlike anybody else.
Right.
So you are an unexperienced partner.
Right.
In that area.
Right.
Because you just don't know.
Yeah. And you gotta relearn it anyway.
Right.
And then over time it may change. So you gotta relearn it then too.
Right.
So you actually, like, real talk, having multiple partners prior to your spouse puts you at a disadvantage.
Right, because then you keep thinking about, like, I like when blah 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 did that and blah 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 did that.
Right.
But then you get in a marriage and your husband doesn't like at all blah 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 blah.
Right.
And so now you're like, now you feel unfulfilled.
Right.
Because you like when blah 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 did blah blah blah, and now you're asking your husband to do all of that.
Right.
And he's like, no, that's something that I'm not gonna do.
Right.
Let's figure something else out. Or your wife is like, that's a little too far out of my comfort zone.
Right. I'm not swinging from the chandelier.
Right. So, yeah. So they're like, no, I'm not gonna.
Yeah, I'm not doing that.
I'm not comfortable with that.
I ain't her. She ain't me. He ain't me.
So then let's talk about, when is it appropriate to have the sex?
The sex. When is it appropriate to have the sex?
When is it appropriate?
Right.
And in that same article, there was another portion of the article that I really thought would hit home for us, or give us a good picture. And it says, his first command to Adam and Eve, which is God, his first command to Adam and Eve was to be fruitful and multiply. One very foundational purpose of sex is to create new living beings. Fruitfulness is not limited to having children. So have we ever thought that? It's not limited to just having children. A mutual loving and serving sexual relationship between husband and wife can produce emotional and personal fruitfulness as well. Both people are nurtured to grow, develop, and soar, becoming more of what God means them to be.
Yeah, that's good. This was a meaningful article. We're going to make sure to put the link to the article in the video here, because it's worth the read.
Right.
But I like that point that fruitfulness is not just producing children, right? Because actually the scripture says be fruitful and multiply.
Right.
And those two things come together. So it's two separate things that happen. The multiplication seems to speak to children, right?
Right.
But being fruitful, emotionally fruitful, and being able to have a relationship that bears fruit, so to speak, to be able to have a relationship that shows the world what God would have for you is the goal.
Right.
Right. So remember, we started the podcast by saying God designed sex, God created it.
Right.
Right. And so having read that and remembering that sex is part of what God's plan is for us in our marital relationships, he said right? Later on, when we go into what God says about it, we'll see that he says, and the two became one flesh.
Right.
Right. So we made it to near the end of this episode or this podcast, and we've talked about what the culture says about sex. We've talked about what we believe God's design for sex was. So you may be thinking to yourself, so what?
Right.
So what do we do now?
What do we do now?
What should we think about now? So 3 things. It's easy to give into the lie that the culture feeds you, that sex is unemotional and you're supposed to have it and virginity is abnormal. What we want to encourage you to do at the Love Intervention is choose the hard thing.
Right.
Choose the hard thing. Do what's right for you. Right? We're not going to tell you what to do. Either way, you're going to have to make a decision.
Right.
All right? But choose what's right for you. You're going to have to deal with the consequences either way.
Right. And sometimes consequences are not always negative.
Right.
They're not always positive.
Right.
And sometimes they are negative. And so you have to be prepared or prepare yourself to suffer or endure the consequence that comes from whatever choice you make.
Right. And sometimes those consequences grow up.
Right.
And you have to feed them for 20 years.
Right. So sometimes you have to choose the most difficult thing.
Choose the hard thing, which is doing what you believe is right for you.
Doing what you believe God is calling you to do.
Doing what you believe God is calling you to do.
Right.
Right.
Right. So this was a good conversation about the topic of sex. And so as we do, let's see what God says.
Amen. So we're going to do a few scriptures and talk just a little bit about them. All right. So in Genesis 1, God says to the man and the woman that he blessed them and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply. We just kind of talked about that fruitfulness and not only having children, but being fruitful in your relationship and in your relationship to others. That's how it relates to us today, that we should be in our marriage and our relationships. Show fruit, right? And show some advantage. In Genesis 2, God institutes marriage. He just created the woman. He put the man to sleep, pulled the rib from his side. He just created woman. And then the man, once he brought the woman to the man says in verse 23, the man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. 24 says, for this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. God institutes marriage there, and we find that in that marriage relationship, that sexual relationship becomes extremely important, right?
Right.
1 Corinthians 6, I'm going to have to read quite a bit of this one. 1 Corinthians 6, starting in verse 17, all the way through 20. Listen up. But the one who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with him. If you accept Christ, you become one with Christ. Flee immorality or flee fornication. Every other sin that man commits outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body.
Right.
Right? Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own, for you have been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. When we're talking about sex, what do you do? What do you have to do to have sex with someone? You have to give yourself to them.
Right.
The issue is, and the problem becomes, that your body does not necessarily, if you are a Christian, your body does not belong to you.
Right.
You've given your body and your life to Christ. And if we're talking about having an intervention, a love intervention, we have to understand that your body that you have is Christ's. Right. And giving it away is not how, the way that we give it away most of the time is not how God would have us do it.
Right.
Ergo, henceforth, therefore, the problems that we have in our relationships and with sexual relations.
Right.
1 Corinthians 7 says, verse 1, now as to matters to which you wrote, this is Paul talking to the Corinthian church. He says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman outside of marriage.
Right.
Not that you can't touch a woman.
Right.
But it's good for a man not to have sexual relations is what he's talking about with a woman outside of marriage. Verse 2 says, but because of sexual immorality or the temptation to have sex outside of marriage, let each man have his own wife and let each woman have her own husband.
Let each man have his own wife and let each woman have her own husband.
Yes. So inside of the marriage relationship, you mine.
Not like a side chick.
No side chicks. Ain't no side chicks around this piece.
I ain't wearing no shirts.
Right. So Paul says here, and God says to us that because it's difficult. Listen, God knows. We started this by saying God created sex. God knows that having sex is a temptation.
Right.
But he's provided a way for us to have that and be fruitful in it in marriage. And that's all that Paul is saying here. Because we're going to want to have the sex.
Right.
You're supposed to have the wife. Right.
Or the husband.
Right. And one of the first things that we talked about as the love intervention was starting was whether or not you want to be married. If you want to have companionship, it's one of the foundational love intervention beliefs. If you have a desire to have opposite sex companionship, then you want to be married. Some people will say they don't want to be married, but you want to be married.
Right.
So that you can have the sex. Right. The last scripture is Hebrews 13, verse 4.
Right.
Marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. Right? So in marriage, we talked about when is the appropriate time to have sex, and when is the appropriate time to engage in those relations. Talking about sexual relationships today. And that is in marriage.
Right.
Now you can choose to do whatever you want to do. Outside of marriage, you could choose to do whatever you want to do. And most of us will choose to do that.
We got this thing called free will.
We got this free will thing happening.
Right.
And you can choose how you want to make it work. Our goal here at the Love Intervention is to just present to you the way that God intended for it to be.
Right.
Did we follow that?
We messed up.
You have to ask us in person. But we understand and know that that's what God would have us do.
Right. When you know better, you do better, right?
You know better, you do better.
So we're hoping that our viewers will see this and know better.
Right. See it and hear it.
Right.
Podcast too.
Oh, forgot about you. Love you.
So when you know better, I think that's a good way to close. Now that you know better, do better.
Right.
And we're not talking about doing better sex.
Okay.
So, thank you for joining us today. Had a wonderful conversation about the sex.
Right.
And we enjoyed our time together with you. And as we close, we want to just remind you to do what? Like the video.
Right.
If you liked it. Subscribe to the podcast if this is your first time. The podcast. The show and the podcast, if this is your first time watching or if it's your fourth time, or if you just haven't subscribed, I don't know what's wrong with you. Subscribe to the show and then share it because the information is getting out there. That's our goal. We just want to get the information out there. All of them aren't going to be exciting. This one was pretty good, but we want to get the information out there and so that we can do better. This has been the Love Intervention with Pastor Evans
and Mrs. Evans. See you next time.